Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I read a really interesting article in the newspaper about how Canada is misperceived in Asia Pacific, and we're misperceiving Asia Pacific. It seems like there's a lack of awareness really in both directions. And so I reached out to the author. Stephen Nagy is his name. He's a professor of political science, international relations in Japan. He's come to us from Japan. He's a fascinating gentleman with quite a background as a think tank person, a public intellectual, international relations PhD, and a Paralympian in 1992 in Albertville. So really interesting background. Stephen, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Brian. It's great to be here.
So, what motivated you to write this, reasonably provocative article in the newspaper?
Well, I think many of your listeners might know that Prime Minister and his foreign policy team visited Southeast Asia about a month ago, and they visited a summit called the ASEAN Summit to try and bolster Canadian presence. And it was fascinating because he came back and he said that Canada's here, we're embedded in the region, we're respected, and everything that he said went against all my 27 years experience in the region. And I felt that it was really important to inform Canadians that Canada's not important for the region. The region looks at Canada kind of this nice country. It's a bit cold. That shows up once in a while, but that's not really a reliable stakeholder within the region. And with that, I brought up some of the experience I've had talking to my fellow scholars and think tankers and government people who really look at Canada as really an unreliable partner within the region. And they in particular look at the Trudeau government in not a very favorable light. They look at him as unreliable. They see him engaging in the region through values-based diplomacy, which is not how the region works. The region is very agnostic. It doesn't care if you're black, white, green, red. They focus on trade. And I thought this was important for Canadians to understand as they try to build a literacy about the region.
Why have we been seen that way?
Well, I think some unreliability. For example, when we were engaged in the TPP negotiations, the initial ones back in 2017. At the very last moment, Prime Minister Trudeau didn't show up, and he left his counterparts wondering what happened. The Australians were upset, the Japanese were upset, the Singaporeans were upset. Why did he not come to the table? And it was really this effort to try and insert, progressive values, those important values for Canadians back home, but they're not important for the region. Pivoting to China, same kind of thing. If you follow anything about China, which I do quite seriously, China is run by seven 60-year-old men who all have dyed hair, who come from a very conservative background. And quite frankly, the idea of progressive values in today's Chinese Communist Party state is just a no-go. So I couldn't understand why Mr. Trudeau would go and try to sign a progressive trade deal with the Chinese, and then our Indian relationship is also in a disastrous state. And if you put this in the big picture, back in November 2022, Canada put forward an Indo-Pacific strategy, this 5-year plan to fundamentally reshape how we engage within the region. And, we've blown our Chinese relationship, we've blown our Indian relationship, and ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Countries, don't see us as a reliable partner. So, we have a few problems as we're thinking about engagement in this broader region.
So we should be more transactional and trade focused and less human rights and values oriented?
Well, I think human rights and values are extremely important, but how we talk about them is important. We don't go to Vietnam and talk about human rights. We go to Vietnam, we talk about good governance. We talk about development. We talk about eliminating corruption. These are the languages that I think a country like Vietnam would prefer to talk about. The same in China, the same in India. Putting human rights at the front and center of our foreign policy is going to close doors, not open doors. Should we be transactional? I think we should have a national interest-based approach to the region. And that means that we are at the table, not on the menu in terms of developing new trade agreements, that we're trying to prevent conflicts from emerging, whether it's in the South China Sea or across the Taiwan Strait. And we are adding value to dealing with non-traditional security challenges, such as the next COVID-19 pandemic or climate change. I think this national interest-based approach, where we're at the table and making rules for the region, it makes a lot more sense than having a values-based approach to engaging in the region.
But then it seems like every time, a politician, a prime minister goes to China or somewhere in Asia Pacific or Eastern Europe, they're asked, well, why didn't you raise human rights issues? Why didn't you talk about blah blah blah? So it's as if at least the press is very cognizant of human rights issues and values issues and wants to know why'd you only talk trade?
Yeah, Brian, I agree with this, but I think that as we're engaging in foreign policy, we need to be thinking about, again, what is Canada's national interests? And that means locking us into regions so that we're part of trade agreements. We're part of the next AI regulation. We're part of the next digital agreements. We're part of the next, for example, cybersecurity agreement. These are in our national interests. If we put human rights front and center of our foreign policy, we're really going to alienate many, many, many partners. That doesn't mean human rights is not important, but what it means is that we need to think about the region or the country engaging with, what are our mutual shared interests, where are the synergies, and how we can build stronger, deeper, and more sustained relationships. And again, if you're going to put human rights and democracy promotion and progressive cultural values front and center in your relationship with China, India, Southeast Asia, the region that I focus on, you're not going to get very far. So it's a practical, pragmatic, interest-based approach to the region. But we also can use a different language in terms of how we're engaging on those issues that we cherish back home, focusing on good governance, transparency, and corruption.
So I guess three different scenarios, potential scenarios here. One is if we talk in the future, like we've been talking in the past, which is primarily about a values orientation, you say we're not going to get so far. So we're not going to
That's right.
accomplish much. What's the downside of that? Do we lose trade or we're not listened to?
We're not taken seriously. So if you
Do
come
we
into
lose
Southeast,
do we lose trade?
yes, of course,
We
because
lose
the
trade.
countries within the region are thinking about trade. They're not thinking about, what's important in terms of Canadian values back home. They're going to say,
Okay.
do you want to
So
trade
so
or do you want to talk about your values?
so go the opposite direction. If we talk trade, we drop the conversations about human rights, we drop the conversations about values, and we just focus on trade. Um, we'll get more trade, I presume. We'll improve our negotiation of trade agreements, and we'll increase trade, and we'll have more economic benefits, I presume. Correct?
Generally, yes. That being said, I don't think we need to drop these discussions. I think we need to
Oh,
change the
I'm going to
tone.
come. I'm coming back to the third scenario.
Yep.
I
Yep.
want to ask you here. In that scenario, do human rights abuses or progressive attitudes, if we don't talk about them, do they get worse or they're going to be the same as they otherwise would be?
I think what we see is as development proceeds in this region, more trade, more economics, that some of those values emerge naturally. That as citizens become richer, as citizens enter the middle classes, they start to converge in terms of some of their values. Not all, but I think respect for corruption, are trying to eliminate corruption, more transparency, closer approximation to Canadian style rule of law, more tolerance for different kinds of families and values. These are natural byproducts of a wealthier middle class.
So you're saying that if we focus on the economic situation, we focus on trade, we drop the focus on more progressive values and a values-based organization, a values-based relationship, and human rights. The human rights aren't going to get worse; they're going to get better, but they're going to get better naturally from what would have happened because of economic progress anyway.
That's generally how I understand the issues. Now, it's not like it's not the same as Einstein's E equals MC squared, right? It's not a formal rule, but I think what we generally see is that development does lead to a better governance, less corruption, more transparency, legal systems that work better. There are also some examples where it doesn't, but when we look at South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, these are all great examples where they moved away from, I guess, a more heavy-handed state to a much more transparent state that shares many of Canadian values.
And I agree with you. I guess what I'm trying to understand is, obviously when the prime minister and other people go to China and elsewhere, they think, or at least they're led to believe, or forced into a situation because of politics back in Canada, that they've got to raise these human rights issues, these more values orientation. But I wonder whether they actually think they're going to have a positive impact, and if by not saying something, they're going to have a negative impact and things are going to get worse. I think that, frankly, they have no impact. And so therefore, all you're doing is wasting time and air in talking these things, because you're not going to have a positive impact on the human rights situation, and it's not going to get worse if you don't talk about it. And so therefore, why bother talking about it? Because it's just going to use up space, time, and air. What do you think of that?
I generally think that's a correct assessment that if our leaders come into whether it's Singapore or Hanoi or any of the cities within the region, and that's the priority in terms of how the discussions work, then our counterparts are going to say, okay, let's give them 5 minutes of air, and then let's get to the real stuff. Let's talk about trade. Let's talk about cybersecurity. Let's talk about anti-piracy issues. And when Canada does talk about anti-piracy, or when it talks about trade, or when it talks about contributing to illegal, unregulated, undocumented fishing counter activities, the partners within the region celebrate Canada's engagement. And this is a demonstration, I think, of how Canada can have a practical, meaningful, and sustained engagement in the region that brings values and is respected and really adds value to Canada's reputation within the region.
Which is, I guess, your third way, which is you're not just transactional and you're not just values orientation. You're somewhere in the middle, which is saying things that are relevant and of interest to the local country that you're visiting and dealing with. We're going to take a break for some messages and be back with Stephen talking about Canada's image and lack thereof, maybe in Asia Pacific, and some of these issues. And I want to use his expertise and knowledge to try to really understand some of these issues that we've all heard about in regards to the two Michaels, in regards to where we are in India, in regards to thinking that India actually played a role in assassinations of people in Canada on Canadian soil, etc. Where have we got? How have we got to this situation where Stephen is saying in a national newspaper that Canada is irrelevant? That's a pretty harsh critique of us right now. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We're chatting about Canada's irrelevance in Asia Pacific right now with Stephen Nagy, who's coming to us right now from Tokyo. Stephen, what brought you to Tokyo and has kept you there? You were a Paralympian. Tell us a little bit about your background and what's brought you to where you are.
It's an interesting story. Back when I was an undergraduate student at the University of Calgary, I was fortunate enough to go on an exchange program to China. And we did an intensive 6 weeks of studying Chinese politics and economics and their society. And then we spent 6 weeks in China visiting different cities. And this is back in the early 90s, before China was the China of today. And it opened up my eyes to how much the region's going to grow, how consequential it will be. And I thought it was a really important thing to study. So I came back from that trip and I put together kind of a 10-year plan saying that I want to be as an idealistic undergraduate, that I want to be an expert in the region. So it meant learning some of the languages, Japanese and Chinese. It meant getting a PhD, meant getting substantial experience here. And I've done that, right? I've lived in Japan quite a while. I lived in Hong Kong and traveled through the region. And it's kind of all come to the point where, of course, at my university, I teach about Chinese and Japanese foreign policy and even Canadian foreign policy. I do quite a bit of writing and think tanks to try and provide policy solutions. And then when I can, I try to engage in the public to educate the public about the region, such as the Globe and Mail op-ed that I penned recently on Canada's reputation in the Indo-Pacific.
And tell us a little bit about the Paralympic experience.
This is back in 1992 in Albertville. I participated as a disabled athlete in the downhill and Super G and giant slalom. So that was a great experience, part of my, I guess, my international background. I had an electrical accident when I was a younger kid and lost my left hand. And this was part of the, I guess, the hospital's way of, helping kids, become resilient and get over tragedy. So, working with the WARAMP program in Canada, which you should be familiar with, we all have those key tags back in Canada. They provided some support. I engaged in downhill skiing. I had some talent, and this provided me a lot of opportunity to travel the world. And again, it eventually led to the Paralympics in '92.
Fantastic. What an experience. I hear the skiing in Japan is pretty good. Do you still ski?
Yes, I do. Absolutely amazing powder snow. They get those Siberian cold winds and the moisture from the Sea of Japan. They really have world-class ski areas here. And probably one of the features that I love is there's these natural hot springs that you can jump into, sometimes on the mountain, but usually right after a long day of skiing.
Siberian cold winds. Haven't heard that before. My gosh, doesn't sound all that great. In your bio, you say that you want to bridge the gap between scholarship policy and public intellectualism. What the heck is public intellectualism?
Well, I think scholars talk too much through the ivory tower, quite frankly. Ordinary people don't have any idea when we're talking about theory or methods, and they don't care. And policymakers, I think, sometimes are very practical, and they sometimes they miss the details as they try to put policy forward. And public intellectualism is basically taking my experience in the think tank world and working with policymakers, but also in academia to try and write and communicate and speak in ways that help ordinary people, like my dad or maybe your dad or uncle, that don't know too much about the world, to try and explain things in a more simple way to help them gain some literacy about the issues that I think are important for Canada.
Well, I appreciate your you joining us and doing a little bit of that with us tonight. So thank you so much. Let me address a couple of the issues, if I could. Recently the Canadian government has alleged that the state of India was effectively involved in assassinations on Canadian soil and has really created a friction with India. Tell me a little bit about that and what how you think it's perceived in India. What's the impact on Canadian-Indian relations? Was it a smart thing to do? etc.
Well, I do think that it's not just Canada that has come forward with some substantial, I think, corroborating evidence to suggest that yes, the Indian government was somehow involved with the assassination of a Sikh Canadian on Canadian soil. The Five Eyes members seem to have all come to the same conclusion. So this cannot just be put at Canada's door or our Prime Minister's door. And as a result, it's really created some real problems in our bilateral relations with India. From the Indian standpoint, they look at some of our Canadian Sikh communities, and they see them as platforms for separatism in India, where they're advocating for a separate state called Khalistan. And they see in particular, our current Prime Minister and the Liberal Party facilitating these discussions, or at least appearing at these discussions at sometimes, and demonstrating a real lack of sensitivity about how India is very concerned about these groups promoting separatism in India from the safety of Canada. So it's a complicated story, and I think that we haven't probably managed it very well at the leadership level. Prime Minister Trudeau has brought some of these pro-Palestinian members to India on his India visit, which created huge uproar in India. The I think the way that the assassination was announced in Parliament at the very last moment was also, I think, from the Indian standpoint, inappropriate. But the problem is that there seems to be quite a bit of evidence suggesting that yes, the Indian government was involved in killing somebody, a Canadian on Canadian soil, and this goes against international law. It goes against, I think, the direction that we hope India would go to. But on the Indian side, I think they've very much personalized these accusations. They've put all the blame on Mr. Trudeau, and I think that. Frankly, if we have a change of government, that this issue, it's not going to go away, but I think that we're going to see the Indians take a different tack towards Canada and to resolving this issue. And it's actually inexplicable to me why they've personalized the blame on Mr. Trudeau and been so ardent in disavowing their involvement in an assassination. But I do think the Indians understand that their value is going up as the challenge of China increases, and that this may be a space for them to exert some of their national interests, even as they go against Canadian interests.
So if Prime Minister Trudeau stays in office, a while longer, maybe beyond this sort of spring date that people are thinking about, what should he do differently in regards to India?
I'm very pessimistic about a reset under his leadership. Again, the Indians have very much vilified Mr. Trudeau, and I think unjustly, for his courting of individuals in Canada that are supporting a separate Palestinian state. Is there a possibility for a reset? This is such a big question. Yeah, I just don't see the window, but the cardinal rule of diplomacy is to avoid binary choices, and that means resets, maybe promoting a mutual year of Canada and India and Canada, build mutual understandings, promote educational exchanges, promote mutual visits. These are generally the kinds of approaches that governments use to try and re-engage. But it will take a lot of work, and I don't think the political capital's there in Ottawa.
Patrick Brown, who is mayor of Brampton right now, and certainly was leader of the Progressive Conservative Party in Ontario, and almost became premier until some other issues happened. Had an incredibly close relationship with Modi in India, and I think Pierre Poilievre, the leader of the Conservative Party, is trying to copy some of that. Is that the right strategy?
Well, ultimately, it's what's in Canada's national interests. I do think that Canadian leaders or any kind of leaders really need to look at the relationship, the partner. Where are the synergies? Where are the comparative advantages? How can we depoliticize sensitive issues? How can we invest in the relationship? And personal relationships work well. In the part of the world that I live in, they're less legalistic, they're more relationship based, and that means going and spending time. Let me give you an example from the country that I currently reside in, Japan. The late Prime Minister Shinzo Abe spent a lot of time in India talking to Indians, talking to the Prime Minister, sharing meals. They even welcomed the Indian Prime Minister to Prime Minister Abe's home. It was this relationship building process to build trust and to build that kind of space where leaders can work out things in more informal ways. This will take some time, and Mr. Poilievre, if he does become prime minister, is going to have to do some of this. The question is the Indo-Pacific is vast, and as a prime minister, you have little time. So what do you prioritize? Or do you delegate so that other important figures in the Canadian political sphere are going to invest in that relationship to build the trust that is necessary to move the relationship forward?
India seems to be, either playing a neutral role in the war between Russia and Ukraine, or frankly siding with Russia and supporting Russia at least a lot more than NATO would like. What role does that play in how Canada deals with India today?
So I think Brian, India is actually more complex than how you characterized it. It's energy dependent on Russia, and that continues to be the case. But at the same time, it's diversifying its energy resources and trying to invest in renewables. It's also dependent on military arms from Russia. And this is a particularly challenging relationship because as India looks to Russia, if it alienates Russia, its big concern is that Russia and China will align, and they'll align with Pakistan against Indian interests. So it's moving forward and trying to, again, slowly and incrementally remove its dependency from Russian arms and Russian energy, but at the same time trying to prevent Russia from aligning with China, which would go explicitly against India's interests. So I think Canada understanding that nuance may be able to help India on the energy side. We have tremendous energy resources. We may be able to help India on the arms side. We have some capabilities here, and we may be able to help India again deal with some of the challenged relationships that it has in its region, whether it's Pakistan or Bangladesh. So it's again reading the tea leaves, understanding the complexities of behavior, and understanding that they're not just doing things. They're not just not criticizing Russia because they support Russia. They're avoiding that criticism of Russia because they live in a very, very complex neighborhood with an adversary in Pakistan, a competitive and sometimes difficult relationship with China, and that these relationships could converge to create a very difficult geopolitical situation for India.
We're talking tonight with Stephen Nagy, talking about Canada's irrelevance in Asia Pacific. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back in 2 minutes. I'm going to ask him about the whole situation with the two Michaels in China and the charging and not charging, but agreeing with the United States to hold a chief financial officer for a major Chinese company in Vancouver that led to the two Michaels potentially, and what all that happened and how did it impact Canadian-Chinese relations. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We're chatting with Stephen Nagy tonight. He is an international relations professor, political scientist, think tank guy, and a very smart, articulate public intellectual, or at least someone who's trying to influence us. And he's written a really interesting article in the newspaper recently that I read that really talked about how Canada had become irrelevant in Asia Pacific. And so we are talking about that and trying to understand it better. Stephen, can you tell me a little bit about the whole situation surrounding, this CFO that was held in Vancouver, awaiting shipment to the United States, and the two Michaels, and whether that was connected, and how long they stayed, and et cetera, et cetera. Tell us how that all happened and what the impact was on Canada-China relations.
Well, it's quite the saga, but under the first Trump administration, we saw the Trump administration really trying to stranglehold the Chinese technological giant Huawei, this phone company that was, I guess, creating also competitive technologies that would be would help them in their civil military fusion. And Miss Meng Wanzhou was I think the vice president or chief financial officer for Huawei, and was accused of it was avoiding sanctions or breaking sanctions, and the Trump administration asked the Canadian government to arrest her, and we did. And as a result, the Chinese reciprocated by arresting two Canadians, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavro. There was another Canadian actually that was his sentence was increased, Michael Schellenberg, as well in China at the time. And both Michaels were in jail, I think, for more than 1,000 days. They were subject to torture. It was a very difficult situation. And this was a message from the Chinese to Canada that you need to act independently when it comes to your foreign policy. Otherwise, Canadians would suffer. And unfortunately, both Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavro and the Michael Schellenberg really had a terrible experience while they were in China. And since that time, relations with China have spiraled out of control in terms of the politics. I think that we've seen increasingly, I don't want to say anti-Chinese Canadian, but anti-Asian sentiments in some parts of Canada and growing suspicions about Chinese influence in our Canadian political system, elections, and economy. And today, Chinese favorable ratings of in Canada are at record lows. Trust on China is at record lows. But at the same time, our trade relationship continues to be quite robust. And this is the paradox when we think about China, that, Western Canada, about 15% of its trade goes to China. Canada in general, about 5% of our GDP is related to China, and it continues to be robust, continues to deepen despite these unfavorable ratings. And it's a contradiction that really I think we need more explanation, and also requires more nuanced policy to try and have the benefits, but also protect us from further economic and other forms of coercion.
I was in Niagara-on-the-Lake recently, and they said that business is down dramatically, primarily because Chinese just aren't coming anymore.
No, we've been taken off the favorability list in terms of tourist destinations. And this, of course, impacts all these wonderful places in Canada that we have, whether it's Vancouver or Banff or Whistler or Jasper, Regina, of course, Niagara, Montreal, Quebec. And those Chinese, they came, they spent money, they bought things. It was great for our tourist industry. And this is a demonstration that, if we don't stabilize the bilateral relationship with China, that it can decrease Canadian prosperity. And I think this is, as we engage in the Indo-Pacific region broadly, but also with China, we have to think about how we can stabilize relationships, avoid some of those political landmines, but at the same time, stand our ground on important issues, whether it's cyber intrusions or political interference. And this formula is impossible. Nobody gets it right, but I think we could probably do much better.
We hear about Chinese restrictions on religion. We hear about some people talk about concentration camps or something close to that with a Muslim minority in the northwest of China. I think they're called the Uyghurs. We hear about issues in regards to clamp down on protests in Hong Kong, etc. Are these issues that we shouldn't be cognizant of and talking about and only talking trade? Or what's your attitude toward issues of human rights and the values-based issues that we have with China?
I think we need, as Canadians and Canadian politicians, need to be very clear about the words we use. You used concentration camps to talk about the Uyghurs in Xinjiang province. For me, I guess I think about concentration camps. I was just in Auschwitz in July. That's what to me is a concentration camp where Jews were killed at an industrial level. I wouldn't call the re-education camps for the Uyghur people as concentration camps, but they were an affront to their human rights. They couldn't practice their religion. They were forced to learn Chinese Communist propaganda, and they've had a really, really hard time. I think that Canada needs to speak out about these, but we need to make sure that we are telling the right story. How do we push back against this is also a very interesting story, and I think doing it alone puts a big target on Canada and Canadian businesses. Working in a coalition is a probably better way to try and help the Uyghur people or the Tibetan people or other minorities within the Chinese context. And again, I think it's less about using these explicit terms of human rights and democracy, and more about trying to where can we help these people? How can we preserve some of their traditions? And who are the key partners that we should be working with to make this happen? There's no perfect solutions, quite frankly. Even the Muslim majority countries haven't been supportive of the people in Xinjiang, which is shocking. Because they have the same religion, they have transnational connections, and this speaks to China's economic influence globally and in these countries. So again, Canada needs to have a nuanced approach, use the right terminology, and form those coalitions to try and put pressure or improve the situation of minorities or people that have human rights challenges within China, but in a way that helps them more than puts a target on them.
Canada has put in place a tariff against Chinese electrical vehicles. We've turned down Chinese acquisitions of mining places in the Arctic because of concerns about proximity to military bases, supposedly. We've had restrictions on Huawei and 5G. Are those smart tactics, smart strategies, or not?
They could be smarter. So let's give you an example of the tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. That was done unilaterally by the Canadians, 100% tariff, I believe. And it was done before, I think, legislation was taken to protect the vulnerable industries in Canada to reciprocation by the Chinese. So as soon as we put on the tariffs, the Chinese reciprocated it and basically stopped some of the, or increased some of the tariffs on Canadian agricultural products. So, if we're going to engage in the tariff practice, then we want to make sure that we're protecting our vulnerable industries. On the mining zones, I'm actually in full agreement with the Canadian government. We're much better off if we work with the Japanese or the South Koreans, those like-minded partners that share political values, share democratic systems, share rule of law, and that we can, depend on it, that they won't engage in economic coercion against Canadians. So I think, again, it's a smart approach of thinking about how we're going to block Chinese investment in Canada when it's against our interests, how we can protect some of our Canadian interests when we adopt tariffs that are going to push back against Chinese imports into Canada. And then at the same time, how do we engage? And I think that I live in this region, Japan. We call it the Indo-Pacific here. All the countries within the region have favorable trading relationships with China, whether it's South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, all the Southeast Asian countries, even India. So they want to maintain that relationship. At the same time, they have problems. So they're always very prudent and thoughtful of how they disagree with China. And they do it generally in coalitions to prevent broad escalation or coercion coming from China. And again, these are some lessons that I think Canada can learn from to try and improve its relationship with China.
I was in Shanghai in 1988 and looked across the Bund at I think it's called Pudong, and there were
Pudong.
just one-story warehouses. And I went back a couple of years ago, and not anywhere close to your academic achievements, but to do some courses at Fudan University as part of a doctorate in business that I was doing. And Pudong was unbelievable. It was looking like the tower that's right behind you right now. It was incredible, the development that had happened in Pudong. And so I ended up doing a paper comparing the Beijing consensus to the Washington consensus. And I came to the conclusion that the Beijing consensus actually worked pretty good, and the Washington consensus maybe didn't. What's your assessment of the economic progress in China today and the policies that the government has pursued to catalyze that investment and that prosperity?
It's an undeniable success, but it's a success that not only China engaged in, the Japanese did this in the post-World War II period, the Koreans did this in the post-Korean War period, the Taiwanese, the Singaporeans, and Southeast Asian countries are all following a similar model of state-led capitalism. Um, I say capitalism with quotations because the Chinese market is not a capitalist market in the sense of South Korea or Japan or Canada, but they've done a tremendous job. 500, maybe 600 million people have moved out of utter poverty. They've built cities, they've built universities, they've built infrastructure. This is the best time in all of Chinese history ever to be Chinese. It's prosperous, but they have a long ways to go in terms of internal China and the far western provinces in terms of really broad development as we see in South Korea and Japan, in Taiwan. Where is it moving now is really an interesting question, Brian, because under the current leader, Xi Jinping, what we've seen is a much more concentration of the government involved in the economy. We see that the government has adopted laws to inculcate Chinese Communist Party members into every organization in the state, which means that, for example, in your radio program, there'd be somebody from the party making sure that you are following the party's questionings for Professor Nagy. So that's a bit creepy, right? And if you think about how this is going to affect international trade, well, ultimately you wonder as an international business working with the Chinese, is this business independent, or is the business just an extension of the party when the party representative is in the business? So again, there's a much more heavy presence of the state and of the party in the Chinese economy. The structural advantages that the Chinese have enjoyed, and that means population, are now declining very, very quickly. So wages are up. That means it's more expensive to do work in China and to produce things in China. We see more regulations. We see less confidence in the Chinese system itself. And these are all downward pressures on the Chinese economy. So, for your listeners, if they're more interested in this, Asia Society out of New York, Rhodium Group does some great work out of Chicago, Merix out of Germany, Gavgao, which has offices throughout China, does some really great work on getting you a sense of where the Chinese economy is going. And I think most argue that it's moved into a period of stagnation, and that stagnation is broad-based with some bright stars that are keeping the economy afloat.
This has been fascinating. We got to take a final break, and come back with a couple of last questions with Professor Stephen Nagy, our international relations expert, coming to us from Japan tonight. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I'm having a really interesting chat with Professor Stephen Nagy. He's an international relations professor. He's an author of some fascinating articles. He's a para athlete. He's just a fascinating gentleman. Stephen, I got to ask you, in 1988, had my final exam in business, government, and international relations at Harvard Business School. And it was a one-page picture of the cover of Foreign Affairs that said something to the effect of Japan is going to take over the world. Discuss. What happened? Japan in 1988 was going to take over the world.
It's a story that is being played out all over East Asia or the Indo-Pacific region. It reached a level of growth within its economy that was not sustainable anymore. Wealth was being derived from property rather than producing things. And
what
we saw
the comment about the Imperial Palace was worth as much as all of Manhattan?
Actually, it was some say it was worth as much as California. So again, this has this idea that property became the currency of wealth, and as you know, property is limited. So the Bank of Japan basically said we need to pop this puzzle. If the most elite people of our society have to commute 2.5 hours one way to work, our system's broken. So they popped the bubble. And they popped the bubble without really preparing for the structural changes that were necessary to put Japan on the right track. And it's taken 30 years for Japan to try and deal with some of its challenges, but I think it's a bit too late. The graying population, low birth rates, it's become much less competitive. Its productivity levels are low, meaning that Japan is comparatively much smaller. But I mentioned that this story is being played out all over the region. South Korea has the lowest birth rates on the planet. I think 0.7 kids per family. China and Chinese people are not having families anymore. The Taiwanese, the Singaporeans, Southeast Asian countries, with the exception of the Philippines and Indonesians, are not having kids. So, those old stories of overpopulation have given way to low population and graying populations, which is putting huge downward pressures on the region's economy. The middle classes are shrinking rather than increasing. And this means that this region by size is going to be incredibly important, but the quality of growth is going to probably decrease as these negative demographics put huge downward pressures on not only the Japanese economy, but South Korean, Chinese, and Southeast Asian economies. So that cover that you mentioned, Japan will take over the world. Well, there was a similar cover with China. And, the Indians are thinking that there's going to be a cover one day about the Indians as well. But again, you need to drill down into the data and the granular data, the aggregate data on population, middle class, resources, the effects of climate change suggests that they're not going to be at the top of the heap. They're going to be maybe at the middle, and they're going to be heavily impacted negatively on all these downward pressures.
Before we go, I got to ask you, what's going on in North Korea? Sending troops to fight in the Russian war against Ukraine. We hear stories about loudspeakers blasting noisy sounds at the South Korea. That there's a chance for a restart to the Korean Peninsula War. What's going on with North Korea?
Well, Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea, sees a golden opportunity to enhance his regime stability by contributing to the Russians' war efforts in Ukraine. He sent 12 to 15,000 men to go and help the Russians fight the Ukrainians. He's also sent 5 million munitions to the Russian front to fight the Ukrainians. And in exchange, we think he received some satellite technology, some launch technology to help fortify the deterrence capabilities it's developing in terms of weapons of mass destruction. They want to hang on to their regime. They want to make sure that the next generation moves forward. But at the same time, we're seeing North Korea think about and watch what's happening in the Ukraine front in terms of its backyard. It sees an asymmetric advantage between Russians and the Ukrainians. And the Ukrainians have used drones and they've used different kinds of technologies to fight a much more superior military. And I think that the dispatch of these men, 12 to 15,000, is just about as much as fighting the Ukrainians, but learning those tactics so they can bring it back to the peninsula to fortify their defenses against South Korea and the United States, and what the North Koreans understand as a containment strategy against their regime.
Last question. I've had the privilege of going to Bali and to Phuket, some of the most beautiful places in the world. You're in the area, in the Asia Pacific. What are your favorite places to go? What would you recommend?
There's an island near Okinawa called Ishigaki, has beautiful, beautiful scuba diving and snorkeling. Taiwan is the great place to fill your belly with wonderful, wonderful Taiwanese and Chinese food from all over the country. I like the island of Koh Tao in the Gulf of Thailand. It's not developed. You can stay in a bamboo hut and have lychee shakes or a cold beer at the end of the day. There's some really beautiful places. But again, there's nothing like seeing the Great Wall of China or going to Xi'an and seeing the terracotta warriors or climbing Mount Fuji. There's more than enough in a lifetime in the region to enjoy all parts of the region.
Stephen Nagy, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. I think you've all given us a really good sense of the issues in Asia Pacific for Canada, for them, and it's been a real pleasure meeting you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much. It's great to meet you.
That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining. I remind you, I'm on every